sex workers and other vulnerable groups. They are more affected by HIV and tuberculosis than the general population. And for HIV, we have the tools. We have PrEP, we have antiretrovirals that work and are not too expensive. We have the tools. For tuberculosis, we need tools. We need tools. And why are tuberculosis and HIV linked? Tuberculosis is the actual cause of death of almost half the diabetes. So they are very linked. We have the tools for tuberculosis, we need tools for HIV, we have tools, but we need money. And we spoke about last year that we need money, and now we have a dire situation. Not everyone knew how important the financial contribution of FAR and USAID were. A very high proportion of the international financing of the HIV work in the world came from the United States, FAR and USAID. And we are very unsure how much it will be cut. It will probably cut a lot. It is a dire situation. And then we have the Lusaka agenda. The Lusaka agenda sounds perfect and fabulous. It is possibly the most important trend in international health systems at the moment, and it is the turning to the national health systems. And of course, it doesn't make sense to build up a parallel internationally financed health system on the side of the national health system in the country. But the problem when we focus on the national health system is just what we heard from Bruce and Sipan. The people who really need the healthcare, the most vulnerable, the key populations, do not have access to the national health system because of legislation, discrimination, stigma, self-stigma, expected stigma, so many different factors that work together and make it impossible to reach. So we need solutions. Now I will introduce Laila and Dimi, of course. Dimi Gatcha, who's come all the way from, and suddenly I fear putting you in the wrong country. Zimbabwe? Born in Zimbabwe, yes. But now you are coming from Botswana, yes. So Dimi, introduce yourself and tell us your solution.
Thank you very much. Greetings, everyone. My name is Dumiso. I was born in Zimbabwe. I spent just over a decade in South Africa, which I think influenced my most fundamental years in activism. And I'm a citizen of Botswana. And I think, I was just reminded as we were hearing about Ukraine, as we're hearing about the context of Malawi, that the situation is a lot more dire than explained. Firstly, through the Trans Monitoring Project, over 5,000 lives have been lost in the last 15 years. I think that is 5,000 too many. And we must also recognize this was in a context where gender diverse and trans people were getting some element of progress. As of this year, 65 countries criminalize lesbian, gay, trans, and gender diverse individuals. And I must say, even in the countries like my own, in Botswana, where there's been decriminalization, legal gender recognition, gender affirmative care are still denied to trans and gender diverse communities. I think, it's important for me not to be emotional. So there's certain, remarks that will be very important given the current context that we're in. So there are 5 main points. The first is recognizing that we are in a time of crisis, but that many of our community members, including sex workers, imprisoned folks, have been in crisis. And I think it's important for us to recognize that, especially in repressive environments, for many communities, multilateralism was a possible avenue for accountability, advocacy, and amplifying some of the experiences that were on the ground. But now, unfortunately, multilateralism is transactional. It's important to recognize that the arguments for solidarity and morality are no longer effective. We're seeing this, especially coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. But also we know from as early as 2014, for example, the Swiss changed their overseas development assistance investments to transactional means where it's only where there's trading partnerships. And so if international cooperation is only ever rooted in economic indicators, what does that mean for many of our communities that don't even participate in those economic mechanisms? Even though we saw a lot of solidarity during the COVID-19 pandemic, I think the recent events have shown us that solidarity is reserved for certain groups. We saw it with interactions between the Trump presidency and South Africa, where only certain groups were declared to be worthy of migration and support. And I think also in the naming of atrocities, particularly for people of color across the majority world. And I think it's important for us to recognize how punitive now international law and humanitarian systems are, reminding us that their solidarity is only reserved for certain groups. And I think it's important for us to also recognize that when we speak about the Global South, it is the majority world, where we're acknowledging that a majority of the world's population is located outside the West. And I think even after the plundering, exploitation, and extraction of human and natural resources historically across generations, still, there can't be any form of gratitude, solidarity, care, or moral authority to at least redress historical injustices. I think it's important for us to acknowledge that in many of these instances, a lot of countries have got state debt. State debt where interest payments compromise their very own health systems. So when we speak about the Lusaka agenda, how can we even have the moral authority to expect that a country will be able to take care of its people when it needs to service its debt? I think it's also important to recognize that colonial history and its legacy still live in global financial architecture, but also with inherited laws, like my own country, like in Malawi, in Zimbabwe, and many others across the majority world. The global gag rule did not start with Trump. It started under the Reagan presidency, and it outlived different Democratic and Republican governments. And I think most glaringly, it's very clear that whenever there's been some form of progress for oppressed groups, whether it's women's rights, whether it's sex workers, whether it's safe abortion, whether it's removal of HIV criminalization, somehow someone who's not impacted feels threatened. And I think the big question is, how does my dignity and progress in my existence deny you of yours? We have seen how executive orders from the United States, how the highest courts in the United Kingdom continuously police the rights of women's bodies. And I think it's very important in how this shows states can subjugate and oppress trans and gender diverse people, over regulating what womanhood should look like, sound, feel, especially for those who do not live, experience, and endure life. Because ultimately, these are the same people who propose and question why should we allow trans and gender diverse people to exist in society. I think this has emboldened politicians in other regions, and I think it's important to even speak how very near the 2-year anniversary of Uganda's anti-LGBT law, the World Bank has resumed giving loans to Uganda. What does that essentially mean for communities on the ground? I am even reminded of countries like Mali, where there have been a recent coup d'etat, where LGBT individuals are criminalized. And I think this is not unique because the consideration of Sahel states, so that includes Burkina Faso, have essentially criminalized when they have never had criminalization laws post-independence. If this does not give an example of how stigma, discrimination, and state-sponsored violence is pervasive, regardless of democratic institutions, income, country status, and the legality of being allowed to love, exist. And I think it's really a reflection that it's not just elected leaders who influence the possibilities of being trans or queer, of existing, regardless of a health status or the kind of work that you're engaged in. I think this is important for me to recognize how a lot of peer organizations working in development can also perpetuate phobias. And so it's important for us to recognize that human rights cannot be eaten. And I learned this when I ran for parliament in Botswana, is that when you're engaging community members, they will literally sit there and ask you whether human rights can put food at the table. And I think it's very important for us to recognize that you can't even have that kind of conversation when the state in itself doesn't provide basic service delivery, and more importantly, information and rights are not enabled. And I think this is critical to speak because Botswana, after 58 years of one-party rule, only recently decided to have a new social contract with its citizens, with opposition having won. And I think for me, it's also recognizing that the common denominator, wherever right-wing parties win or anti-rights protests emerge, is because of a cost of living crisis. So if it's not just the developing or middle income countries that are struggling to make ends meet and ensure that there's dignity in people's lives, the wealthy countries also have found themselves in cost of living crisis. And we consistently see this because LGBTI individuals become political pawns. So when politicians can't answer for their electoral promises, we bear the brunt of the violence and the blame. I think it's very important for us to sort of recognize that instead of governments and churches taking care of their people because they've got significant resources historically and currently, they enable state-sponsored violence against LGBTI people, migrants, those who advocate for safe abortion, and those who advocate for human rights. Someone benefits from the subjugation of others, and I think it's important for us to ask ourselves who that is. Businesses have benefited from funding cuts, increased surveillance, housing migrants in hotels, and now, from what we understand, in detention centers, because federal laws have been changed in the United States to not have private prisons. And I think we must also recognize that people that have benefited the most from state interventions, recovery processes, have been those in the profit-making sector. In turn, they help governments negotiate foreign policy. We have seen these with very problematic local office meetings, but also influencing what a country can essentially negotiate to compromise its sovereignty, stripping away of safeguarding on social media and against their very own queer staff. The state works with profit against people and planet. Who do we turn to when politics only fuels pre-existing stigma, discrimination, and violence? Where does the responsibility of the state come in to protect the universality and indivisibility of human rights, particularly when multilateralism is transactional? Earlier this year, we had a malaria crisis despite there being political will, with our head of state and several former ministers leading regional malaria elimination efforts. Our courts had to force our own government to provide free antiretroviral treatment for imprisoned migrants, despite socioeconomic rights not being justiciable in our country. This reflects how, regardless of political will and the right to health existing in one's country, will never be prioritized when economic growth is the only measure of human progress. The increases in influenza-related waves, whilst TB remains a threat, shows how income country status, like my own, as a high middle income country, which is assumed to take care of its own people, has no bearing, particularly with the three diseases of HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis. And I think it's important to recognize that this has compromised Africa's development and health outcomes. The conventional metrics of development and growth are no longer effective and impactful enough to transform society. I wanted to close my remarks with a gesture, but now I realize I actually left my bottle, but I really just wanted to bring, really practically drink a pill in front of you. This is because in my country, this would not be possible. Not that it's legality, but purely because even those who I love would be shocked. And I think for me, it's not even an issue of being embarrassed. No, it's not even an issue of recognizing that I'm different. I'm used to this because I'm queer, because when I walk, I'm like a public pride billboard, whether it's in a banking branch or in a mall. But because it's not safe to do so, particularly socially, we must recognize that decriminalization does not mean equality. And it's important for us to recognize that culturally, in workplace environments, or even with the people that we are in love with, stigma, discrimination, and inequality affects every single person. At last year's Pride panel, it was quite clear that the health systems that we are told to rely on, that international funders want to invest in, do not have the credibility and the capacity to be trusted by our own communities. I cannot separate which part of me is triggered when eliciting ignorant remarks from health practitioners, hate speech when I'm walking down the street, or violence, even in the context of my own relationships. Similarly, I cannot separate who I am when I go to a health facility and expect dignity from a government department. The US's funding cuts have taught us that development interventions, even those funded by wealthy countries, such as Norway, are not actually sustainable. That the nutrition program that was funded by the US government impacts Norwegian funded programs in education. That ignoring investments in upholding democratic institutions, the impacts of sexual reproductive health and rights issues, and grassroots interventions essentially means that we're compromising the state of HIV, the state of gender equality, the state of malaria, and the ability to target and counter TB. I think more importantly, that the world philanthropy, private philanthropy, funding partners followed US government-related cuts and arrogance, even though they did not have a Trump themselves. Amidst this polycrisis, communities remained in mutual aid, in solidarity, navigating their work in activism. I was amazed when speaking to UK and Dutch NGO networks in the past 2 weeks that they were doing a lot of thinking and reflecting on their own strategies, whilst communities in the majority world are actively working and challenging the systems that obviously subjugate without the resources. And as a result of that, for example, with my own organization, having to take the government to court for having cancelled social contracting agreements. And I think this is very telling, is that the assumption that domestic resource mobilization will be the solution when countries criminalize, police our bodies, might be a little bit flawed, particularly because we don't have the accountability mechanisms now, even at the United Nations. It's important for us to recognize that we will continue to challenge power, privilege, and patriarchy because we are alive and because we have always survived autocratic leadership, low funding thresholds, and systemic inequity, even though we don't have to. The communities that we are in, and that essentially, because funding have existed and we have now seen them translate, our communities are essentially the bedrock of resilience and sustainability, not our governments. This is a consistent reminder that community health is reflective of the queer communities across the world and across history, that our existence is a form of resistance. Thank you.
You will back to then I will give the word to Laila from LHL International. And I think we can just ask the panel to come on.
I just wanted to say a few words before I welcome the panel. I work for LHL International Tuberculosis Foundation, and one hidden secret is that tuberculosis is the infectious disease that takes the most life in the world. And every year, 1.2 million people die from TB, and it's the major killer of people living with HIV. I have worked with this disease for 15 years, and I have to say I've never seen an acute and large crisis as it is now. Access to healthcare is a rights issue, but it's also a medical and epidemiological issue. We have to ensure treatment for infectious diseases to stop the spread of disease and to stop people from dying. After closing down American funding for TB and HIV in January this year, it is estimated that there has been around 100,000 extra deaths from TB and HIV over those few months. So on that rather pessimistic backdrop, I want to invite our youth politicians. It is Signe Ramson Høie from the Workers' Youth League, AUF. Please join us on the stage. Nikolai from the Young Conservatives, Unge Høyre. Hege Vetås from the Socialist Youth, Sosialistisk Ungdom. And Hans Jakob Hund Thomsen from the Young Liberals. So first I want to say thanks to everyone for coming on a Sunday. We're very happy to have you here. Sorry. No, yeah, that's fine. First, I just want to ask all of you actually just to reflect on what you have heard today, what you've seen in the videos, and what you may have said.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for the brilliant remarks. I think it was really heartbreaking actually hearing about it. And often when we Norwegian politician talks about, education or transportation, whatever the issue is, it's important, but this is a matter of life and death. And, Elon Musk said that not a single person has died since the US aid cuts. But the reality is that according to different calculations, 100 people are dying every hour. So during this debate, 100 people would have died. And the people who are most affected by this, as I mentioned, is the most vulnerable. And unfortunately, it's not only the US. I mean, we talk a lot about the USA cuts, which, they stands for, I think, a third of all the foreign aid in total. But, the UK are reducing their aid budget by 40%. The Netherlands, which used to be an important donor, especially for this issue and sexual health and reproductive health, who stepped up during Trump 1 administration, they are now cutting their aid budgets as well. Sweden, for instance. So I think this is an extremely important issue, which doesn't near enough get the attention it deserves. And I think it's important to, the highlight that has been said by Dumi and others, that, we have the technology, we have the resources that we need. PEPFAR alone, which was started by Republican president, by Bush Jr. in 2003, and saved, I think, 23 million lives. And to put that into perspective, that is the equivalent of preventing 17 big passenger planes from crashing every single day for the last 20 years. So I think that's, counts for how important that is and how, how big our opportunity actually is to help people and save people's lives. So I think this is an extremely important, and thank you so much again for the brilliant remarks.
Right. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for being here, and thank you to the International Activists and Dumi for for being very I think, correct and well thought through picture of the situation. I think it's clear to everyone that what is happening right now is an international crisis for queer people, for trans and gender people, for people of color, working class people, incarcerated people, sex workers, all over the world. I think it's a situation of truly unprecedented dimensions, and that we like that the implications cannot be overstated. And I also pick up especially one thing that you said, which is those human rights put food on the table. I think that was a very good thing to pick up, because I think that while human rights don't necessarily put food on the table, I think that food might put human rights on the table. Yeah. We know that it is much easier to hate and fear and that stuff. We know that when we have no food, is to feed everyone, that everyone has a bit of meat snack. It's way harder to paint a picture of someone as a as kind of strawman for hate. I think homophobia and transphobia are kind of the most obvious recession indicators there are. And I think that when we see those issues, we also need to see the issues lying around of economic crisis, of unjust distribution of resources, and that when we see those of systemic racism, and when we see all those issues coming together and in context, I think that's when it's time to start to find solutions.
Thank you. Is the sound okay? Yeah. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the invitation. And thank you, Dumi, for your remarks. I really have a lot with what has been said. And I think what I reflected on the most is how it reflects on how the world has changed the last couple of years. We've seen democracies in decline, a rise of wars. Pablo from Ukraine is one example, and maybe what feels nearest to us here in Norway. We've seen a rise in right-wing parties getting power, taking power, and we've seen a lot of progress we maybe thought was granted or should have come in the couple of years ahead, basically come to a halt. And I think what we need to do and what Western countries need to do is that we need to find a solution on how we replace what Trump has done in the last couple of months. Norway can't do that alone. I think we need to just admit that. And I also think it's important that we take our responsibility, not just because of all these issues we're facing, but also because if we don't do it, we know other countries are stepping up, like China, and they don't necessarily have the interests of people in those countries they give aid to as their main goal. They want to influence and they want to really get more power in the region. So I think Western countries need to step up, and I think we need to get together and find out how we're making a path forward after.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for your perspectives, Dumi. For us in AUF and other social democratic movements, health and healthcare is not just a service; it's also a right. And queer rights are human rights, and that's one of the main reasons why in Norway and in all the countries that we work with through development or aid, and that we support queer rights. Our Ministry of Foreign Affairs has made LGBTQ rights one of their main priorities in their international work. And I think that when Trump were elected as president, we all became aware of where this was headed from his first speech, where he made it clear that trans people don't exist in his view, and that is scary. And I can speak for myself. I was very taken aback by how the injustice became so much louder and bolder now than before. And I think that the aftermath of Trump becoming president has just showed us that we have to work with queer rights and queer healthcare. It has to be a political priority also globally when we work with international politics.
Thank you. Thank you for all the really good answers. We are now facing really troubled times, but it is not something new that the LGBTQI community is being left behind. HIV has been on the rise among gay men and trans people over the last decade. Does anyone want to reflect on why that is?
Well, I can start. I think largely because of the stigma. You know, I recently visited Nairobi in Kenya, and where we visited a hospital with other politicians, where former patients told us, crying about their stories, and you know, the most important story and their most important point was, you know, how immense the stigma is, especially in many African countries. And not only the stigma, but also the lack of knowledge, both about the disease itself, but also about the lack of medicine and you know what to do if you actually get that. So I think that's a very important part, and you know we have in Norway, but it's totally different compared to very other countries as well. I think one thing I want to highlight, because we talk a lot about foreign aid and the importance of that, and I think that is important, but I think we also need to make more African leaders responsible as well. And that was also, you know, nearly every Kenyans I spoke to, and that's not very, you know, hard to understand, because you know, the president is actually William Ruto is one of the most corrupt leaders in the world. And you know, the problem for many African countries are that they're using far too less on health. You know, their health budget should be, you know, accounting for at least 15%. But in reality, it's, you know, 5, 6, maybe 7%. Same goes for education as well. So I think, you know, the West need to step up our aid, not, you know, lose our solidarity. But I also think an important point is to make African leaders responsible as well. And I think, you know, it's easy for me to say, but I also think that's a very important point for Africans who are, you know, very, I'm very grateful for the jobs they're doing.
That brings me a little bit over to the next question, because as Howard was saying, there's a lot of discussion how ODA or BSAM for global health should be about strengthening national health systems with strong country ownership and country-led priorities. However, if in those countries where social norms and stigma excludes trans and queer persons or even put them in prison, what can be done in this setting? So you mentioned accountability of the leaders. Do you have any other suggestions of what Norway can do? Again,
first of all, I do really think that the Western world also needs to take accountability for our actions in the global south historically. Nikolai, you said earlier that with nations like China, maybe we do think that they have other interests to protect human rights. I think it's very obvious that so does the US and so does the Western world, and have for a very long time. We still see the aftermath of colonialism. It is still actively going on, and many Western countries in the global north are still actively protecting interests in those countries. So I think that the global north and the Western countries also need to take accountability and to show some solidarity and give financial aid and people.
Yeah, ODA.
Okay, to develop better the strong public sector and affordable healthcare. I think that's very important. And also, I think historically, HIV has been something that has not been taken seriously until the really fast in a big way. I think that, or I know that, when measures against AIDS were placed in the US, those were targeting trans people, people of color, working class people, Latin American people in the same way that it was directed towards white cisgender people. So I think when we see it in a historical perspective, we can deduce that when we finally set in measures again things for example HIV that targets queer people for the most part. We need to see who are actually getting the aid, and we know that is especially right now people in the country, people in the global north. And so we need to just be.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to respond?
Yeah, I don't think a blame game is so interesting. I think it's more interesting to discuss what we can do forward. And I think the most important question is not only how much money do we give or how much aid can we give. I think the most important question is how much progress do we actually make. And in the last 10 years, Norway has increased our foreign aid budget. We are the only country in the world who gives 1% of our income to foreign aid. Still, we don't see the results we want to in a lot of countries. So I think we also need to have a discussion on what type of goals we set on financial aid and what sort of demands we can make to governments to receive our foreign aid. And there's a lot of countries that we can make demands. That's the whole point. We give a lot of money and we know that the countries need the money. We talked to Bruce from Malawi. Malawi is one example. I think we gave 500 million Norwegian kroners to Malawi last year. We are able to set demands, to make demands to the Malawian government, and I think we should do, and especially on healthcare. I think we also not only need to build up a strong public health system, but also continue to support other community centers or initiatives from organizations, especially in the countries where the situation is most dire.
Hey, you have a quick comment and then it's in that.
Yeah, I just want to draw back to earlier when you guys said that Norway can solve everything on its own, which is true, and which is why I don't think it's productive to see the financial aid that Norway is giving and the situation we're in today and what direct conditions between that. There are other interests at play, and I think we need to see a full picture of what powers are working against free liberation and equality in other countries, and not just Norwegian financial aid includes results.
I think that when healthcare access is dictated by morality instead of science, people die, and the HIV epidemic among trans people and the queer community, it reflects a structural failure, and queer communities were never fully included in the mainstream health system, and I think that's one of the main maybe reasons or issue, and I agree with Ron. Norway should definitely become even better at using our voice when it comes to pushing for more inclusive health systems and work with this as part of a broader human rights approach in our international financial support.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to address something that Nikolai said, which, what are the results that we have achieved? And I think that that's an important issue to address because, unfortunately, not only in Norway, but the whole West and especially in the US. Speaking too loud.
No, it is very.
But, many people are, especially in Norway, we see it from a lot of surveys, most people support foreign aid, but they don't think it actually works, which is kind of paradoxical. But that's the reality. If we look at different surveys, and especially in the US and all the Western countries as well, most people support foreign aid, but they don't think it works that well, to be honest. And I definitely think a lot of foreign aid could be more efficient, could be better. I come back to that, but I want to just address what we have achieved because take for instance Tanzania, which is the largest. We're in the biggest partner country for Norway, and there they have doubled their economic growth in 7 years, where it took Norway 40 years to achieve the same. We have reduced child mortality by 80%. Many people can go to school and get a job, and of course, Tanzania is not a rich country, but I want to address that we do achieve results both on the national level, but also just take Gavi for instance, which is a very important global fund, which Norway's contribution alone has saved 2 million lives just since I was born. So I think it's important to actually say that foreign aid has huge effect, and much more effect than what we can achieve in Norway, which is it's perfectly reasonable because money counts way more in poorer countries. But at the same time, I want to point out that we should make aid more efficient. And one solution to that is to prioritize. And that Norway has been very good. And I think, if I can do that we should, as Signe said, prioritize global health and especially sexual and reproductive right, not only because it's important, not only because it's a human right, but because it's very much neglected by other donor countries, and that Norway has unique competence and credibility in this area.
Thank you. Yeah, very happy to hear that, of course. And I have to say, TB and HIV, ending TB and HIV is one of the most cost-efficient things we can do.
Yeah.
So we just have 2 more minutes. Is there any questions from the audience? There was something that you want to clarify. If not, I want to ask Jimmy if you have some last comments or questions to the panelists.
Thank you very much. And I think, it's just important to also acknowledge and appreciate that it's obviously very unique to have leadership from across the political spectrum. And I think in acknowledging the importance of not only international solidarity, but also that solidarity is very expensive. But I think what I'm also gathering from everyone is also recognizing the need for narrative change, being able to actually speak to the concerns of voters, being able to speak to the concerns of a country when they want efficiency and accountability. And I think, consistently, for me, the question is, how can we ensure communities are actively participating to ensure that efficiency and that accountability and benefit from that prioritization? Because I think when we have too many hierarchies, we're consistently going to get that exclusion because systems essentially do exclude others. And so I think for me, the biggest danger is other countries emulating. If countries in the global north are preferring not to invest in SRHI and human rights, that means those countries won't do the same. And so how can you sort of not compromise the gains that have been made, generational gains, right? And ensure that that can be consistent even from other partners So I think it was great to appreciate those different voices. And then more importantly, I guess it's really just to say, you know, what is the call for action, right, in terms of political leadership now, especially because, you know, we obviously want more young people to be elected. And so I think that really is the question, what is the call of action coming from?
Yeah. What you want very quickly, the call of action for the future.
Well, I personally, I think an organization who believe that the grounds for real meaningful change is grassroots activism. We believe that we can change public opinion from the bottom up, and that we have to do so in order to make real change. The past year, or the past years, really, we're seeing rights being rolled back at a level extremely period to be fair, at real. And we think that the reason for this is that when change is only on grade level, legal level, that we can go all the way down. And that's the grounds for equality and for liberation have to be come from the bottom up and the networking for it to be constructive and not be rolled back.
Thank you. We are now on overtime, but I'll give the final word to Stigma.
Yeah, I think that you can't build a inclusive healthcare without the people that it's meant to serve. And so civil society is the backbone of and health. So it's important that we also work with civil society and people's attitude and values when it comes to inclusiveness. And that's also very
Thank you. I wish we would have more time to talk. Very interesting. But I just want to say thank you for coming and thanks to everyone for listening. And then to give you just a small token of our appreciation. So thank you and happy Pride. Thank you.